Hey everyone, welcome back to Panels to Pixels. My name is Josh, and recently, in anticipation of the release of Marvel's Spider-Man on PS4, I had the great honour of appearing on one of my favourite podcasts, Comics on Consoles. If you're not familiar with the show, then you are really missing out. Each episode, host CHRIS CLOW takes on a comic book game and goes super in-depth into the comic book history, the making of the game, the historical context, the critical reception, and so much more. I consider myself pretty clued up on all this stuff, enough to run a YouTube channel about it anyway, but I always come away from listening to the podcast having learned something. I appeared as a guest alongside comic book game veteran and fellow YouTuber Chris Baker and the man behind comicgamersassemble.com and author of an upcoming book on Spider-Man games, Blair Farrell, to talk about one of the first ever 3D superhero games and one of my favourite games of all time, 2000's Spider-Man, developed by Neversoft. What you're about to watch is just a small excerpt from that episode in which we talk about the legacy of the title and share our memories of playing the game for the first time back when polygons were jagged and microtransactions were just... That was a dumb joke, but anyway, here we go. Enjoy.
Well, Chris, you were a member of the gaming press at the time that this game came out, working for the official PlayStation magazine, is that right?
That is correct. Official U.S. PlayStation magazine, if you want to get the whole OPM. OPM is what everyone called us.
Sure. So if you could, go back for us and paint a picture of the climate of gaming from your perspective at the time, because I'm sure that working in that office gave you some pretty decent access to what the general zeitgeist of the video gaming world was, especially in an era before comic book games were really paid much attention to compared with today. So with that, what did the arrival of Spider-Man bring to the table for the games of the time and for you personally? And what was it like getting the chance to actually review it for OPM?
Yeah. You know, I mentioned earlier that there really weren't any good superhero games at all on PlayStation up to that point, which was very near the end of the life cycle. And, you know, when this game came out, our magazine was already like gearing up for the PS2 launch. Like that was why people were buying our magazine more so, I think, than the reviews of PS1 games at the time. We're also in a period where we talked about Superman on Nintendo 64 earlier. That was a year before this. They actually canceled that game on PlayStation because it was, I think, because it was so poorly received.
Right.
So like that was the last kind of real superhero video game launch, and it didn't go over well, even in the purely PlayStation kind of perspective. Everyone knew about that game and how bad it was. So, we were, and just in general, this was an era of movie games coming out for pretty much any action movie, all kinds of licensed stuff, and it usually wasn't very good. It had the superhero games were terrible, licensed games were generally not good. So it had kind of all the odds against it. So it was actually pretty easily dismissed if you weren't a fan of the character, which, I was getting into my being a hardcore fan of the character. That probably came most around when the movie came out. But, I was definitely more of a fan than like pre-Maximum Carnage and pre the TV show and everything. But around this time, it really actually made me super excited. I first saw it before I started working for that magazine it was on the cover of Electronic Gaming Monthly about a year before, which was in the same building as OPM. And so I would eventually know those guys who wrote that story. But yeah, so it was like people were kind of impressed with the way that it looked and everything, because it actually was a very good looking game. Just the kind of comic book aesthetic really came through. And I think that really worked for it. Worked really well on the PlayStation, where, the graphics were a lot simpler than we're used to now.
Sure.
But you had all these bright costumes and comic book environments and that sort of thing that kind of really made it shine through so to impress people. And so people were, they, as the kind of information came out and the screenshots came out, like everyone was sort of getting a positive view of it. But people like me who were really into comics were getting super invested, and I was really happy with the way it turned out. I gave it a 5 out of 5 in my review. Most reviews were somewhere like in the 80%. So I was higher than most, probably because I'm a fan, but I don't regret it. It's one of the few 5 out of 5s I gave, and I do think it is still one of the most important superhero games. I think probably Arkham Asylum is the most important superhero game, but this is certainly for its time was the most important superhero game.
It's funny that you bring up Arkham Asylum, because it seems like, at least with what you're describing, both Arkham Asylum and Spider-Man had kind of similar trajectories. I mean, maybe Spider-Man didn't make as much of a big splash as Arkham Asylum did comparatively, but they both seem to, at least from what you're describing, come in kind of under the radar, but people thought that they looked kind of cool. And then when they actually came out,
I think Arkham probably came in more under the radar because it had been so long. Actually, Batman's game history is better than Spider-Man's before that. But it had been a really long time before like a really good Batman game had come out. Mm-hmm. Nothing in the 2000s. I mean, Vengeance was okay, I guess, but there was nothing really remarkable in the 2000s for Batman. And so that one definitely kind of was just this Batman game that IDOS was putting out back then. People forget that part too.
Right. Sure.
Yeah. But Spider-Man in 2000, I do think told the world that a 3D superhero game can be good at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. So kind of the same question then for Josh and Blair. Take us back to the time you first got to play Spider-Man. Were you aware or excited about it before it came out? And what did you guys feel when you actually got the controller in your hands and played it for the first time? Josh?
Yeah, well, I said to you guys earlier before we were on air that the first time I would have even seen this game would have been on the front cover of official UK PlayStation magazine. And I'm trying to think, like, had I seen even a 3D rendering of Spider-Man up to the point? I think there were some commercials for the toys and things like that, and occasionally you'd get like a really dodgy 3D rendering in the animated series. But up to that point, it was, I think, the only time I'd ever seen a 3D Spider-Man would be someone dressed up, or even like the Nicholas Hammond TV series and things like that. And It was really striking to me seeing this character that I was so used to seeing in pen and ink, kind of leaping off the front cover of this magazine to me. And that magazine, I think that must have come out a month before the game's release, and it had a demo, which was the first level, kind of going towards the bank heist. And I was it's just from playing that demo, it was one of my favorite games of my childhood. But I just want to also, because we've said how groundbreaking this is as a 3D superhero game, and I know we also alluded to the Marvel vs. Capcom series, but also I want to kind of pay lip service to X-Men Mutant Academy.
Which, yeah, it's a terrific game. I love that game.
Yeah, and obviously it's a fighting game, so it's limited in the kind of scope of what it could do and how much it could really turn the genre on its head, really. But I think those two games and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 all came out in September in Europe, anyway. It was all within a month of each other, and those three games are really my fondest memories of the PlayStation 1. And in terms of like them being at the tail end of the PS1's life, I think that you can also make an argument that that's when a lot of innovation happens, is at the end of a console's life cycle. And I think that I cannot overstate how I think it's difficult for people now really to appreciate how this is pre-films or anything, how crazy it was to see 3D comic book characters. It was quite mind-blowing at the time. Just going off the back of what you're saying about the Arkham thing, I think that this really can be seen to be the Arkham of its day. And I think that the reason that they both succeed in that way, especially Arkham Asylum, I think there's a lot of parallels, is because they, as you were saying, it's a time capsule of how the character was perceived at that time. And also I think it succeeds in taking the best elements from it cherry picks the best elements from every adaptation of that character. So in the same way that the Arkham series took the DC animated universe and kind of took some of the voice actors, but paired it with this kind of like gritty realism of the Nolan films. Spider-Man 2000, does the same. You've got voice actors from Spider-Man Unlimited and the animated series. And, as you said, I think the fact that this came off the back of Spider-Man's dark days of the Clone Saga and things like that, and the kind of the speculator bubble bursting, you get a distillation of the character that was very much influenced by the animated series, and the animated series itself succeeds by simplifying that and saying, everything has got so bloated and convoluted in the comics. Let's take it back to Liam Ditko or Liam Romita. And I think that's where the success of this game lies, in the same way that Batman Arkham Asylum said, let's take what works about this character and throw out everything else that doesn't.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very valid perspective, and one that I completely agree with. Blair, how about you? How aware or excited were you before the game came out? And what did you feel when you got to actually play it for the first time?
I don't actually remember seeing a lot of it. I only had a Nintendo 64 until actually Christmas of 2000. So I was reading Nintendo Power, and I don't remember getting a lot of coverage. I didn't remember, it wasn't really on my radar. The Christmas before in 1999, my brother got a PlayStation, but he was in university, so he would only be home for Christmas and the summer. But that Christmas, getting my teeth into a PlayStation, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe what I've been missing. I played like Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil 3, and I couldn't wait to get back. And it was around that time when I started getting into other consoles. I became disenfranchised a little bit with Nintendo because I had the N64 for so long. The first time I remember seeing it was commercials during the Electric Playground. I think Chris did a video about Spider-Man commercials, and you can find it in there. Chris Baker, rather, because I know there's two. And it was, the commercial was like, you don't play it, you live it, and it looks so cool. And I was around that time, actually. The PlayStation 1 came out, the ONE. There was a PlayStation that was the size of like a sandwich container. And a bunch of people I knew, they suddenly got a PlayStation 1 because it was super cheap. And they all bought Spider-Man because I guess everyone was a huge Tony Hawk fan. And in the commercials, the last line is from the creators of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. So I guess that was the big push. And everyone was talking about it. Like, oh man, there's this game, you can do all this stuff. And I was really jealous of them. And then in October of that year, I went to go visit my brother in Ottawa, where he was in university, and he went to a Blockbuster and rented it, and we sat down and played it. It was like so crazy, as I was getting to experience all of this hype that people were talking about this game and how much fun it was. And it was such a cherished memory of mine. And then I renting out the N64 version when it came out in November, being so disappointed because all the presentation is sucked out, like all the cutscenes are gone. And even as I totally forgot until last week when I replayed the N64 game, it doesn't have the awesome remix of the theme song during the credits, which is one of my favorite parts of that game.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, it has some short character models, but yeah, that was, and that year, I remember like Chris talking about it, that year was a big year for the PlayStation. It wasn't, they had that redesign, and then a lot of people couldn't afford the PlayStation 2. I think it was $600 in Canada where I lived. And that year was such a big year. You still had Spider-Man came out in September. I think X-Men was during the summer. Final Fantasy IX came out, Dino Crisis 2, Mega Man Legends 2. There was like still a lot of life in the PlayStation, and you know, the PlayStation 2 was a new the next thing with DVDs, but I think there was a lot of life in the PlayStation to have something like this was, a treat towards the end of that console life cycle, and something was a lot easier to play when I eventually got my own PlayStation later that year.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this little snippet, I highly recommend checking out the full episode at the link below, and also all the other episodes of Comics on Consoles. It just genuinely is great stuff. Alright, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!